important topic for you, one that I believe very strongly you could see in a short answer question format or even an essay. This is about the growth of African slavery in colonial America and its consequences, and this will cover many periods in the APUSH curriculum. All right, so periods 1 through 3, these periods focus on the growth of slavery in colonial America, particularly in the 18th century, both before, during, and after American independence. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a great potential short answer question or essay topic. If I were an AP test writer, which I'm not, I would choose this. So some big idea questions you should be able to answer. Why did indentured servitude decline in the colonies, especially in the Chesapeake? And you remember what the Chesapeake is, right? What two colonies? Yeah, look at you little genius. You know it's Maryland and Virginia. And why did that give rise to African slavery? What impact did the growth of slavery have on America? And how did African slaves resist and or challenge their situation? All very important questions you should be able to describe in detail when we're done with this. All right, so if you open up the curriculum, it'll state reasons for the growth of slavery. And there are going to be 3 of them. So this sounds to me like it could be a short answer question, ask you to determine which one was the most important. One reason we have is a high European demand for American cash crops. Colonial America, tell me what that cash crop is from the Chesapeake. That's right, it's tobacco. If you're in South Carolina, it's going to be something like rice or sugar. So there is this unbelievably high demand for these crops in Europe. So that will lead to a need for a large labor force, which unfortunately will lead to African slavery. There's also going to be difficulty in enslaving natives because they were susceptible to disease, they knew the land well, and could run away. And there's also a lack of indentured servants, especially after 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion. So be able to identify and explain all 3 of these. So let's talk about this high European demand for cash crops. Well, British colonies focused on the growing of cash crops. That's what a lot of the economy was based on in early colonial America. As I mentioned, you have tobacco, sugar, and rice. Tobacco in particular in the Chesapeake. Wealthy plantation owners, they wanted to expand their land holdings. The more land they had, the more cash crops they could grow, the more cash they could make. And this is this cycle that would keep perpetuating itself over and over. Now, cultivating these crops was incredibly difficult work, very arduous, and required extensive labor. So if you were in Maryland and Virginia, for example, again, the Chesapeake, they grew tobacco, South Carolina grew rice, and the West Indies would grow sugar, and this would be exported all over the world. Think about the triangular trade, this idea of trading with many different parts of the world. Jump on over to Native Americans and slavery. Now, as a whole, they were not enslaved in large numbers, and that's because of high death rates due to diseases such as malaria or smallpox. And again, as I mentioned, they were familiar with the land, so they could run away easily. And although the encomienda system existed, and that was really in the Spanish colonies, it was outlawed in the mid-16th century, and that was replaced with labor from African slaves. Now let's talk about the decline of indentured servants. A large number of immigrants to the English colonies, especially the Chesapeake, they came over as indentured servants. They would serve about 4 to 5 years. They would sign a contract, and the plantation owner would pay for them to come over, and in return, they would work for about 4 to 5 years. Now the headright system that's essentially encouraging indentured servants to come over by giving plantation owners 50 acres of land in addition to having an indentured servant come over. Now that gave these plantation owners more land, which could then be used to grow more crops, which could then be used to get more money, to buy more land, to get more labor, to grow more crops, and again and again and again, it's this cycle. Now in 1676, this is a turning point in colonial American labor history. There's Bacon's Rebellion. This is a rebellion in Jamestown, Virginia, led by Nathaniel Bacon. He got a bunch of landless whites in the west of Jamestown that were kind of outside the scope of the city of Jamestown. And they were upset with the governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley, so they rebelled. They wanted protection from natives that Governor Berkeley was not willing to give. Nathaniel Bacon and his followers, they burn Jamestown to the ground. Berkeley has to flee. Eventually, Berkeley gets sick and dies, and the rebellion is crushed. Now, it's very important to know if you're writing an essay about slavery, here is the detail you need to include. As a result of this, plantation owners in Jamestown, really the Chesapeake, and began to switch from indentured servants, and they moved towards slavery because indentured servants eventually got their freedom and they would become restless without land. So they moved to a more permanent forced labor source of slavery. If you're writing an essay about slavery, that's a very important topic to explain the growth of slavery in colonial America. Now, what are some of the consequences of the growth of slavery? Well, we have an emergence of a strict racial caste system. Interracial relationships were illegal in southern colonies. That's unlike, for instance, the Spanish Empire, where you saw a caste system, but it was a racially diverse caste system with groups like mestizos and mulattoes. It's the status of the mother, not the father, that would determine whether a child is a slave or not. So if the mother was a slave, that mother's children would automatically become slaves, regardless if the father was free or slave. It did not matter. Now, in some areas of the West Indies, slaves made up the majority of the population. More of the people living there were slaves. So this will lead to strict slave codes to regulate their behavior. Now, let's talk about slave resistance. Most slave resistance came in covert forms, and that's running away, that's breaking tools, that's faking sickness. Rebellions did happen, and there's a couple you have to know, but they really did not happen often. There was some overt, whether it's through sabotage or rebellion. The Stono Rebellion in 1739 from South Carolina, in which a group of slaves killed many whites and tried to flee to Spanish Florida where they would be free. And Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, which this contemporary drawing from that time illustrates. This was a slave rebellion in which Nat Turner and many others killed whites in South Carolina and rebelled. And Nat Turner and many of his followers were killed. And as a result of all these rebellions, it will lead to more strict slave codes. There's also an emergence of surrogate families when families were broken up due to the slave trade, which is one of many horrific parts of slavery. Also, there's a blend of African and American culture and religions, and African slaves were not given their freedom in the Declaration of Independence, under the Articles of Confederation, or the Constitution. So even though this revolution was fought, slaves did not benefit from it and receive their independence. So there is over time increased calls for abolition. For example, in 1780, there's Pennsylvania's Gradual Emancipation Law, which gradually outlawed slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, the same year that Nat Turner's rebellion happened in Virginia, he was a Northerner who published a weekly newspaper called The Liberator, in which he called for the immediate and uncompensated end to slavery. And this will be published for 34 straight years until the Civil War ends and the 13th Amendment is ratified. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787, that does ban slavery in the Northwest Territory, which includes Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. All right, so some test tips for you, multiple choice and short answer. Be able to identify and explain specific reasons for the rise of slavery. That's why I started this video with. Make sure you can do that. What were different ways slaves resisted their situation? And slave codes in areas where slaves made up the majority of the population. Be able to identify and explain that. For essays, you could see a topic like explain the causes and effects of the growth of slavery, and an essay about the impact of slavery on the development of the South. Maybe comparing and contrasting the development of the South with, say, New England and the economies of both areas. All right, I'll finish up leaving you with a short answer question for you to practice. You're to answer all three parts. The late 17th and early 18th century saw a rise in African slave labor in the British colonies. 1. Briefly explain one reason for the rise of African slavery in the British colonies. 2. Briefly explain one impact for the rise of African slavery in the British colonies on Africans. And 3. Briefly explain one way African slaves resisted slavery. And remember, for the short answer parts, you want to answer each in at least 2 to 3 sentences. All right, guys, I thank you very much for watching. Best of luck on all of your exams, especially the one in May. And be sure to check out my other videos in the writing series. I'm discussing turning points. We're doing some comparing and contrasting. Definitely topics that you could see on your exam. So I appreciate your support. Thank you very much, and have a good day.